They laughed at Freud. They called him crazy, a heretic obsessed with sex. But few realized what truly made him dangerous. He dared to peer into the female mind without filters, without morals, without fear. While the world spoke of virtue, Freud spoke of desire. While society saw sin, he saw drive. And when he revealed that the female unconscious was as complex, profound, and symbolic as the male's, perhaps even more so, silence fell upon the halls of the European upper middle class. He didn't just describe the structure of the mind, id, ego, and superego. He mapped an emotional territory that to this day many pretend doesn't exist. A place where logic bends, where no sometimes means maybe, and where the body speaks what the mouth denies. Freud understood what no one wanted to admit. Female desire is not linear, not rational, and not tameable. It is not born of merit, but of mystery. It is not guided by promises, but by energy. While men sought formulas to conquer, Freud unraveled symbols to understand. He showed that women do not want to be deciphered, they want to be felt, that they can ask for peace and desire fire, ask for calm and desire strength, ask for love and desire presence. And this does not make them contradictory, it makes them human. The unconscious is poetic, not logical. And that is why those who live only by reason will never understand the magnetism that arises from the invisible. Freud saw this, and that is why they silenced him, because his discovery hurt the male pride of those who wanted to control what was born to be felt. What Freud left as a legacy was not a manipulation manual, but a mirror. A mirror where each person must have the courage to look at themselves and see their own unconscious reflected. Understanding the female mind is understanding oneself, because the same impulses that drive her desire live within every human being. And perhaps that's why this truth still frightens, because it dismantles the game of appearances and reveals that love, desire, and the soul speak a language the conscious mind doesn't master. This is the secret blueprint Freud drew, not on paper, but between the lines of every gesture, every silence, every look that attempts to hide what one truly feels. Freud never saw the female mind as an insoluble enigma, but as a living architecture made of layers that communicate through symbols and silences. While most sought answers on the surface, in gestures, words, or mood swings, Freud delved into the subsoil of the psyche, where the unconscious whispers what the ego tries to silence. There he realized that the female mind cannot be reduced to reason or objective logic. The ID, with its eros and thanatos drives, dictates the rhythm of ancient forces long before any conscious decision. This is why so many men, trapped in the idea of predictability, become confused by seemingly contradictory emotions. They try to understand an ocean using a ruler. Freud showed that it is necessary to understand the structure of the mind, the tense balance between id, ego, and superego, to avoid getting lost in the tides of desire and repression. What Freud saw clearly was that much of the conflict in relationships stems from repression. From childhood, we learn what is acceptable and what should be hidden. This internal censorship becomes a defense mechanism, shaping adult behaviors that seem logical but are actually echoes of childhood trauma. A woman may say she wants security but unconsciously seek intensity. A man may want to please, but feel angry when he realizes his kindness doesn't arouse the same desire. The human mind is a battleground between what we feel and what we believe we can feel. Psychoanalysis, as a healing method, didn't come to label, it came to reveal that every gesture of love also carries a trail of fear, and that desire is a secret conversation between parts of the soul that rarely see eye to eye. Freud knew that understanding the female mind was not an act of decipherment, but of humility. It means accepting that the unconscious speaks through images, dreams, and lapses, and that the body often reveals what speech represses. He observed, for example, that dreams are the coded language of repressed desires. Dreaming is not an escape, it is a disguised memory. And understanding these symbols is like entering an old house with hallways that lead to rooms locked for years. What many men don't understand is that women don't want to be analyzed. They want to be perceived. Not in the sense of control, but of presence. And when this presence arises from self-awareness, from integrated libido, it becomes a bridge. It is through this bridge that true connection begins, and it is there that the next secret lies hidden. Desire arises not in the conscious, but in the invisible roots of the unconscious. For Freud, female desire isn't organized along the same illuminated streets where reason walks. It inhabits ancient alleys, paved with symbols, experiences, and inherited instincts. It's as if the female unconscious were an ancient library where each book was written in invisible ink, and only those who read with their bodies can understand. Conscious logic seeks predictability. If she says this, it's because she wants that. But the unconscious works with contradictions, ironies, lapses, and dreams. Libido, that vital energy Freud described as the driving force of all drives, doesn't move through coherence. It moves through magnetism. And it's in this magnetism, sometimes silent and unpredictable, that fascination resides. The female mind responds to archaic codes of attraction and emotional security, which can't be deciphered with words alone, but with presence and sensitivity. These ancient codes come from the same source that creates fear, pleasure, and love. Freud said that the unconscious is not just a repository of memories, but an active system, one that acts and reacts. It is governed by the pleasure principle, not by the morality of the superego. Therefore, a woman may often feel attracted to something that consciously contradicts her. It's the old conflict between Eros and Thanatos, the life drive and the destructive drive dancing under the same skin. She may desire the mystery that challenges her, even fearing its power over her. And this is where the ego tries to negotiate, creating rational justifications for emotions that don't obey logic. The result is this fascinating paradox. The more one tries to understand desire through reason alone, the more it slips through our fingers. Understanding this process means understanding that female sexuality isn't just biological, it's symbolic. It's an emotional language coded since childhood, shaped by repression, myths, and small wounds that the unconscious never forgets. A look, an absence, a word spoken in a specific tone can trigger dormant memories. Freud showed that all desire is also an attempt at healing. The body seeks, in relationships, what the soul seeks to resolve. And that's why love is so often confused with the rediscovery of trauma. When a man understands this, he stops competing with desire and begins to listen to it. Listen to what's behind what's said. Because what's heard isn't always what's desired, and what's desired sometimes doesn't even know how to express. And that's precisely where the next enigma arises, the distance between what's said and what's felt. Freud said that speech is merely the surface of the mind, the sound the unconscious lets out when the ego is distracted. Behind the "I want," there's a whole body saying the opposite. The body speaks what the mind senses, reacts to what the superego tries to disguise, vibrates according to what the id silently demands. This is why, in so many relationships, words sound coherent, but gestures reveal a completely different story. A woman may say she wants tranquility, but the sparkle in her eyes betrays that what moves her is intensity. She may claim to seek stability, but she engages with the unpredictable. This incongruity isn't a lie, it's human nature. Freud saw it as the inevitable clash between the conscious and the unconscious, where the former tries to control the latter, but the latter always finds a way to manifest itself. In practice, it is the body that reveals the secrets that speech tries to hide. A glance away, a long pause, a nervous smile, each gesture is a chapter of dream theory in full wakefulness. The body, after all, is the waking dream of the unconscious. When Freud analyzed his patients, he realized that the truest answers came between the lines, in lapses, in untimely laughter, in words that escaped like disguised confessions, and he discovered something uncomfortable. Libido does not speak the language of morality. Desire, shaped by eros and thanatos, can hide guilt, fear, and pleasure in the same space. Therefore, the verbal "I want" is merely the diplomacy of the ego, trying to negotiate with the impulses of the id and the prohibitions of the superego. In the end, the body always votes, and its vote is the most honest. Understanding this distinction is essential for any authentic relationship. Psychoanalysis teaches that listening to another person isn't just about hearing their words, but also observing the invisible space between what is said and what is felt. This requires presence, a listening that goes beyond the ears, a perception that transcends rationality. It is in this silent listening that men begin to comprehend the true map of female desire, a territory where reason loses its map and instinct guides the compass. When they understand this, they begin to realize that no can have layers, that refusal is sometimes a defense, and that the unconscious plays at hiding what it most desires to reveal. And it is in this ambiguous, tense, and magnetic space that the first rule of desire begins to take shape, the one that shatters the comfort of certainty and opens the door to contradiction. Freud never wanted to justify moral confusion, but rather to understand psychic dynamics. When he spoke of the no in desire, he spoke of a language older than words, the language of drives. In the unconscious, no can be protection, a test, fear, or even desire disguised as defense. It is the boundary where the ego tries to maintain control, while the id pushes for expression. This ambiguity is the heart of psychoanalysis. The human being says, "I don't want," while the body, in subtle gestures, reveals curiosity. It's as if there were two voices vying for the same microphone, one rational and the other primitive. Therefore, Freud said that the unconscious is timeless, illogical, and symbolic. What seems like a contradiction is, in fact, an ancient form of communication between eros and thanatos, between the impulse to surrender and the fear of loss. Tension is the invisible spice of desire. When everything becomes too predictable and safe, the unconscious begins to yawn. Freud observed this in emotional bonds. Where there is no friction, libido empties. Therefore, the no sometimes emerges as a way of preserving the fire, not extinguishing it. Retreating can be a dance, an invitation to the psychological game between wanting and resisting. Of course, it takes emotional maturity to differentiate the symbolic from the literal. Conscious consent is sacred. What Freud explored was the internal territory, where the mind creates tension to fuel its own desire. It is the human paradox. Pleasure grows in uncertainty, and mystery awakens what comfort slumbers. It is as if the unconscious were saying, "Prove to me that it is safe to lose control." In everyday life, this understanding changes everything. Instead of being offended by ambiguity, a man learns to listen to what's behind it, the emotional energy, not just the words. A woman might back away out of fear, test out of insecurity, or say no while observing whether there's firmness on the other side. It's not manipulation. It's the unconscious attempt to feel safe enough to surrender. Freud showed that desire is not a straight line, but a labyrinth made of doors that open and close as the tension changes. Psychoanalysis invites the individual to observe this interplay soberly, unhurriedly, and without guilt. Because it is in this tension that magnetism is born, and it is in this magnetism that the next lesson is revealed. Desire obeys neither justice nor goodness. It obeys intensity. Freud was one of the first to show that human desire does not obey the logic of morality, but the energy of drives. He observed that libido is not driven by goodness, but by tension. The unconscious doesn't care about what is right. It seeks what is alive, what awakens. This is why so many good men feel invisible. They confuse virtue with magnetism. Freud drew attention to the fact that the superego tries to impose justice, but the ID seeks intensity. And it is from this friction that desire is born. The good man, trapped in the idea of merit, believes that the more correct he is, the more he will be loved. But the feminine unconscious does not desire the just, it desires the whole, that which does not repress the fire, but rather dominates it. Psychoanalysis has never advocated chaos, but has shown that the repression of desire is as dangerous as its disorder. Mystery, for Freud, is what keeps the unconscious curious. When everything is predictable, desire falls asleep. It's like a book whose ending you already know. There's no longer any fascination. Mystery, therefore, is the art of not giving yourself over completely at once. It's not manipulation. It's rhythm. It's allowing the other to participate in the discovery. Freud saw this as the drive of eros, the life instinct that seeks expansion, contrast, and movement. It's the same principle that makes fire exist. It needs air, but not excess. When someone gives themselves completely, leaving no room for mystery, the unconscious feels the cycle is complete, and desire fades. It's the intensity that creates the bond, the friction that sparks interest, the not knowing that fuels desire. Being good is beautiful. Being intense is vital. The mistake lies in thinking that one replaces the other. Freud would say that a woman desires a man who strikes a balance between the creative eros and the disciplinarian thanatos, one who possesses light but also shadow. The too good man often denies his shadow, tries to win the game with purity, but the female unconscious perceives the lack of depth. There's a lack of emotional density, a lack of contrast, a lack of mystery. And that's what the mind silently seeks. Freud didn't preach that we should abandon goodness, but rather unite morality with vital energy. Because desire arises from the encounter between danger and security, and this tension, when understood, reveals something even more powerful. Female desire doesn't just want what is said, it wants what disarms her. Freud said that the female unconscious responds less to words and more to the energy that sustains them. When a woman asks for calm, she may be testing whether the other person is capable of maintaining center in the face of chaos. When she provokes, she may want to feel firm on the other side. This happens because desire doesn't seek comfort, it seeks contrast. At the unconscious level, there is a life impulse that requires resistance to feel alive. Freud explained this through the dynamic between the id and the ego. The id wants expansion, pleasure, intensity. The ego needs to contain, shape, create, structure. What attracts is precisely this encounter, the clash between impulse and containment. When a man understands this, he realizes that his role is not to dominate, but to sustain. Invisible leadership is this silent force that conveys security without imposing and power without crushing. In practice, this means that presence speaks louder than promises. Freud observed that the unconscious perceives subtleties that the conscious ignores. The tone of voice, the rhythm of breathing, the gaze that doesn't waver. These bodily signals are read as maps of internal power, and this is where the notion of self-possession comes in. A man who possesses himself who doesn't react impulsively, who doesn't lose his bearings in the face of tension, awakens instinctive trust. The feminine unconscious captures this energy because it symbolizes protection, stability, and emotional depth. It's as if silently saying, "Here is space for me to be without losing myself." This kind of leadership doesn't need to be declared, it's perceived. It's the opposite of explicit control. It's the force that creates freedom, not imprisonment. Freud saw libido as an energy-seeking symbolic expression. Therefore, female desire is not rational. It wants to feel power, but also surrender. It wants control, but yearns for surrender. What activates it is not the predictable gesture, but the unexpected that reveals consistency. It is the man who knows how to stop when the body says not yet, but whose presence makes the no begin to melt. It is the gaze that guides without holding back. It is the serenity that sustains the impulse. This balance is rare because it requires self-knowledge, the kind of emotional sobriety that Freud believed to be the true goal of psychoanalysis. And to understand this is to enter a new dimension of desire, where power ceases to be a struggle and becomes magnetism. And magnetism, as Freud would say, thrives on something that is disappearing in the modern era: scarcity. Freud believed that desire is an energy driven by lack. It is the emptiness that awakens the search. It is the not having that keeps the wanting alive. When everything is available all the time, the unconscious loses the game. It needs the interval, the pause, the uncertainty. In dream theory, Freud explained that the unconscious creates symbols precisely to fill what is absent. Desiring is trying to touch what escapes, and that is why in any relationship, excessive presence can become anesthesia. The other ceases to be a mystery and becomes a habit. The libido needs to breathe. It needs the tension between eros and thanatos, between the movement that brings together and the distance that preserves. Scarcity here is not a lack of love. It is the art of keeping the mystery alive. It is the pause that allows the unconscious to continue dreaming. The man who understands this realizes that mystery is not a separation, but a form of presence. Freud saw this as a kind of affective dialectic. Desire feeds on fantasy, and fantasy needs space to develop. Being constantly accessible kills psychic curiosity because the unconscious stops projecting. Have you ever noticed that passion is born when there's something to be achieved, but dies when everything becomes obvious? It's the same mechanism that makes a child lose interest in a toy after winning it. Desire is movement, and movement requires distance. Absence in this sense is not indifference, it is nourishment. The feminine unconscious associates mystery with depth. The predictable man may be safe, but he is rarely magnetic. Freud showed that desire needs small deaths to be reborn with greater strength. Creating scarcity is therefore creating symbolic value. In the modern world, where everything is instantaneous, absence has become the new luxury, and those who understand this become rare. The secret is not to hide, but to preserve oneself, to have one's own time, one's own silences, one's own desires. Freud would say that true power lies in the ability not to offer oneself entirely to the gaze of another, but to leave space to be imagined. This applies to love, to work, to art. Mystery creates tension, and tension generates life. It's the same principle of libido in motion, the flow between wanting and not yet being able to. And that's where magnetism resides, when the other senses you are present but never completely surrendered. Because those who possess themselves don't need to prove themselves, and it is this inner possession that reveals the next secret. Desire follows those who have direction. Freud said that female desire is not guided solely by physical attraction, but by the instinct for emotional security. In the unconscious, a woman seeks in another a symbolic representation of structure, someone whose mind doesn't collapse in the face of chaos. What activates her is not perfection, but inner coherence. When a man possesses himself, he conveys a rare sensation that he is capable of containing his own intensity. This self-mastery is an unconscious interpretation. The woman senses, without it being said, that there is a strong ego within her, capable of dialoguing with the id without being swallowed by it. Freud saw this as psychic maturity, the balance between drive and consciousness. A man who constantly reacts to the other's desire, who molds himself to please, doesn't inspire trust. The female mind, intuitive by nature, recognizes who has a sense of balance and who merely feigns stability. Self-possession, according to Freud, means recognizing one's own unconscious and not denying its shadows. The man who acknowledges his own aggression, jealousy, fear, and desire without completely identifying with them becomes whole. He doesn't repress the id, but neither does he let it take control. It's the true dialogue between ego and superego. This kind of balance is magnetic because it creates an aura of invisible leadership. It doesn't need to be spoken, only perceived. The female unconscious interprets this as solidity. He has a center. This solidity isn't found in ready-made phrases, but in the way he positions himself in life, in the way he speaks, in the way he respects silence, in the serenity with which he deals with the unpredictable. Freud believed that psychoanalysis was, at its core, a journey of individuation, becoming master of oneself so as not to be held hostage by the world. In practice, a man who possesses himself inspires naturally. He doesn't chase, he walks. He doesn't compete, he leads through presence, and this presence doesn't come from calculated phrases, but from a life with purpose. Freud would say that libido, when integrated, stops seeking only pleasure and starts seeking meaning. Female desire is attracted to this kind of energy, that of a man who lives in harmony with his own drives, one who doesn't fear the unconscious, but observes it with curiosity. He doesn't try to be good all the time, he tries to be truthful, and this truth, paradoxically, is what is most disarming. Because a woman, ultimately, wants to follow someone who knows where he's going, someone whose internal structure is so firm that his presence is enough. And it's when this type of man appears that the game changes. And understanding these rules reveals why so many good men feel invisible before the mystery of desire. Freud said that there is no rejection without symbolism. When someone is not seen, in fact, they are being read differently by the other person's unconscious. The good man often falls into the friend zone, not because he lacks love, but because he lacks psychic tension. He represents the superego, comfort, morality, predictability, while female desire is driven by the id, instinct, curiosity, and risk. When the relationship stabilizes solely on security, the unconscious loses its contrast. Freud observed this in his patients. The more someone tries to be impeccable, the more they arouse boredom, and the more someone expresses humanity, the more they arouse interest. The too good man tries to protect love by eliminating mystery, and in doing so eliminates desire itself. He wants to be understood when the unconscious only connects through the fascination of what is still unknown. In real life, this dynamic manifests itself in subtle details. The man who responds instantly, who always says yes, who avoids conflict, conveys a predictable energy. The female unconscious reads this as control, not security. Freud called this thinly disguised repression, the impulse to please to avoid rejection. The problem is that the human soul desires not what comforts it, but what transforms it. Desire needs admiration, and admiration is born of scarcity, autonomy, and inner strength. When a man lives only to be accepted, the female unconscious perceives him as emotionally dependent, and nothing kills desire faster than the feeling that the other person isn't enough. Libido, for Freud, is attracted to vitality. And vitality is when someone is alive inside, not begging to be noticed. Understanding these dynamics is liberating. The man who understands the unconscious stops seeking approval and begins to cultivate presence. He learns that being kind doesn't mean being submissive, that empathy doesn't mean being oblivious, that attention isn't neediness. Freud taught that psychic balance is the integration of opposing drives, eros and thanatos, strength and tenderness, reason and instinct. The man who finds this harmony stops being nice and becomes whole. He doesn't try to conquer, he awakens curiosity. And this curiosity is the beginning of a true bond. The friend zone ultimately is merely the symptom of an imbalance, the excess of the superego smothering the brilliance of the id. When he learns to balance both, he becomes magnetic. And it is at this point that Freud's true lesson emerges. It's not about games, but about awareness, and that's what the next point reveals. Freud never wanted to teach tricks to control others. He wanted human beings to understand their own labyrinth. Psychoanalysis was born as a mirror to the unconscious, not as a weapon for the ego. When we talk about desire, we're not talking about manipulation, but about consciousness. Desire is a neutral force. It's what we do with it that defines its value. Emotional sobriety arises when someone recognizes their drives, their defense mechanisms, their needs and shadows without getting lost in them. Freud said that those who ignore the unconscious will be its slave. And this is exactly what we see in so many relationships, people trying to please, dominate, conquer, without realizing they're merely reproducing infantile patterns. True power isn't having the other person in your hands, but having yourself under control. Self-knowledge changes the game because it transforms desire into expression, not dependence. When a person knows themselves, they don't try to be loved. They live so that love finds them naturally. They don't pursue, they attract. Freud saw this as the integration of internal forces, the id pulsating with life, the ego mediating with wisdom, and the superego guiding with ethics. This harmony creates magnetism, not the kind of magnetism that binds, but the kind that liberates. Emotional sobriety is the opposite of coldness. It is the ability to feel deeply without losing one's bearings. It is the calm gaze amidst chaos, the touch that doesn't implore, the presence that speaks louder than any speech. It is the person who has learned from within the language of the unconscious and therefore makes themselves understood even in silence. Freud would say this is the pinnacle of psychic maturity, transforming desire into awareness and love into choice. When someone reaches this state, the relationship ceases to be a search for fulfillment and becomes an extension of one's own wholeness. There is no more play, there is connection. There is no more fear, there is clarity. The man who reaches this level of emotional sobriety doesn't need to prove he's interesting. He is, because nothing is more attractive than someone who belongs to you. Psychoanalysis has always been this, an invitation to stop playing roles and return to center. And perhaps this is the secret so many overlooked when Freud spoke of the female mind. True desire arises where there is presence, not performance. And it is this awareness that transforms love into something mature, alive, and inevitably true. Freud said that the unconscious always wins, and that's why self-knowledge isn't a luxury, it's survival. Understanding what hides behind the "I want" and "I don't know what I want" is like turning on a light in a room where you've lived in the dark. When you understand your own drives, your defense mechanisms, your childhood traumas, and your repressions, love ceases to be a labyrinth and becomes a mirror. You begin to realize that the female mind isn't a mystery to be deciphered, but a universe to be respected. And that desire, when born from consciousness, doesn't destroy, it transforms. Freud wasn't talking about conquest. He was talking about integration. Because those who know themselves don't need to conquer anyone. They simply become naturally magnetic. Now think honestly. How many times have you sacrificed yourself to be accepted? How many times have you believed that being good would be enough to be desired? How many times have you confused attention with love and presence with dependence? Perhaps what you lack isn't love, but inner structure. The same structure that Freud saw as the foundation of every healthy mind, an ego capable of sustaining the fire of the id without letting it burn everything else down. That's what attracts. That's what inspires. That's what makes someone look at you and sense, without understanding why, that there's something there that can't be bought. It can only be felt. So, if this video made you rethink what desire, presence, and true emotional power are, here's an invitation. Turn your eyes inward. The unconscious speaks every day, but few listen. Listen. Observe your gestures, your reactions, your silences, and if you want to continue this journey of deep understanding of the human soul, of what moves us, hurts us, and transforms us, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, with each video, we'll delve a little deeper into the territory that Freud discovered and that the world tried to forget.